many decades, when I would talk about it, I would relive it, and I would actually re-experience that level of fear and trauma that I went through back then. But a few years ago, I came to a little different understanding that I'll share with you later. That it wasn't as horrific as I at first believed. But November 5th, 1975, an ordinary work day, middle of the week, we were putting in some long days trying to get the contract finished up before winter weather. Let's advance the slides and I'll kind of give you a little more background there. We were working on a Forest Service contract up in the forest, high mountain region of Arizona. Mogollon Rim extends clear from New Mexico all the way up to the Grand Canyon, actually. And it's actually the largest ponderosa pine forest in the world. People think of Arizona as all desert, but it's a big forest, and I've been doing this work for years, and my group boss has been contracting there for years. And this is just to give you a more detailed view of what it was, but the ground sloped from this northern part of the map up to this Mogollon Rim area, and then dropped steeply down below towards Phoenix. But the point being that the rim itself was the highest point for miles around. It was over 7,000 feet right there. And from that location where we were working that day, you could actually see straight across the San Francisco Peaks near Flagstaff, which is the highest point in the state of Arizona. You can see they got snow capped most of the year. But go ahead. Reef National Forest, that's the rim. You can kind of see a little bit of the drop off there by the sign. This is right by the highway. This is the crew. Mike in upper left. Crew boss, Ken Peterson, Alan Dallas, Dwayne Smith, John Gillette, and Steve Pierce. Now, Alan in the upper right and Dwayne in the lower left have passed away in the last few years. But every one of these men have stood by what happened to us to the very end. And the way it's portrayed in the movie is kind of accurate, that it wasn't just a group of buddies. We were, a rough bunch of guys, and there had been various fights among us, and so it wasn't smooth sailing all the time. In the movie, Alan narrowly dropped a tree on me that day, and that was true, and that was partly what led to the dispute during the polygraph test, because he was the prime suspect for being the one who had murdered me. And the rest of them were, for some reason, helping him cover it up. Well, we loaded up our equipment that evening, and we're headed out of there. In the movie, it looks like we had been driving for so long that we were falling asleep, but we were still, wide awake, breathing hard from recent hard physical labor. So, our senses were keen. Nobody's drinking. You can't run a chainsaw and drink alcohol. You will cut your leg off, And practically everybody on the crew had some kind of an injury from that kind of work. It's pretty hazardous. It's actually ranked among all occupations in the United States as one of the most dangerous. I've known quite a few people who worked in the woods that were killed in the process. We're driving out of there. We're going up towards the rim road, climbing an elevation, but we were headed south. So it's a real rough road. We're having to go really slow and pick our way around the obstacles and stuff, and it's pretty rough terrain. And so Mike's really focusing on his driving, mainly focused on the rough road right in front of the truck, and everybody's talking away, the windows are down, and I'm looking out there and I see these little glimmers of light coming through the trees. And it wasn't like real alarming, first like, oh my God, what's that? It wasn't like that. It was like, at night in the forest, you just normally don't see a light at all. But the longer I looked, the more it just wasn't adding up with anything I thought it could be. My very first thought was probably deer hunters. We've been hearing some shots in the distance and seeing deer hunters, on the drive-in. And so, but the crest of the ridge was to our right, and the light was coming from higher than where ground level would have been. So that wasn't adding up. And I thought, well, maybe the moon. And then one by one, all these little chattering conversations were going on, and the truck fell off, and everybody started looking before anybody actually said, "What's that?" And John said he was thinking, could that be the moon? But he looks off over in the other direction, sees the moon. I first thought maybe, sunset somehow, the sun had gone down, that maybe it was reflecting off of a cloud or something. It was just a real strange kind of a light that just didn't add up. And then once I figured out that it was coming from higher than what ground level would be, I thought about a time that we were on our way to work, and we hit, there was a tree that had been hit by lightning, and it was burning up there. So that's where the title of the movie came from, Fire in the Sky. We thought it might be a forest fire that, lightning strike. But then that wasn't adding up either, because, we've been having some, cool dry weather. Most of our lightning strikes come during what they call monsoon season in July. That's where all the rain and stuff, there's so many lightning strikes. It's actually the highest number of lightning strikes of anywhere in the continental United States outside the Everglades. So, you could walk through the forest in certain areas and you can't go 50 feet without seeing a tree with a big old blasted scar out the side of it where the lightning hit. And so that was what I was thinking. But then finally, I was like, what could that be? And we started talking about it. And I could see in the road up ahead where there was a little bit of that glow that was shining across the road. I said, Mike, hurry up, get up there where we can see what it is. And he's, mainly just trying to keep it on the road. This is a really rough track. And so as soon as we got where that light was, boom, it was just unmistakable. Mike's looking at the road, and I yelled, Mike, stop! Stop the truck. And he stopped, and he just sort of slammed on the brakes. And there it was, right near the road, unmistakable. The skeptics try to say, oh, all they saw was the planet Jupiter. This was not some little tiny pointed light off in the sky. We could see less than 100 feet away a glowing metallic object hovering there. It was shaped like two pipe cans put lip to lip, like what you would do. There's a double cab truck. That's how we get 7 people in one vehicle. And there it was. And it was just so awesome right from the beginning. It was just astonishing. All of the crew remarked about how beautiful it looked, and how frightening and awesome at the same time. But I was just on impulse. I threw open the doors as the truck skidded to a stop, and I got out and started towards it. And immediately, the crew was alarmed. What are you doing? And I was thinking I'd probably get 3 steps and it'd be gone. Very often you're driving through the woods and you see a wild animal, a mountain lion, something right across the road. And boy, you're lucky if you can get the guys to look in that direction before it's gone. And that's what I was thinking was going to happen with this craft. But it didn't go, and they're getting more and more anxious, and I didn't want to show them that I was getting scared, so I kept going. But I got slower and slower the closer I got to it, and they became more and more frenzied, swearing at me to get back in the truck. And when I got closer to it, the sound it was making, it was such a strange mixture of tones that it was like off the range of human hearing on both the high end and the low end. If you've ever heard a real high-pitched sound where it's kind of like it almost goes off if you turn your head in a certain direction, or some kind of a really super low bass note. I don't know, maybe you might have heard it in a parade or something where there's some kind of thundering sound or a loud vehicle where you're feeling it in your body as much as you're hearing it in your ears. It wasn't extremely loud, but just a really hard to describe sound. As I was standing there, and those guys were getting really frenzied, suddenly it got louder and started to rise up. And just the reflex action was to just jump for cover. There was a log sticking up out of a pile of debris there in the clearing, and I just ducked down behind that. But that required me to kind of go down and forward to get behind that log, because the craft was, up at a 45, and I stopped getting any closer, partly because the pile of logging debris was there. This is normally piled up, and then the Forest Service will come along and burn it, when the ground's wet, so that it safely removes all of this burnable material and reduces fire danger in the woods. But I'm down behind this log, and these guys are just screaming at me, "Let's go, go, go!" And so I decided I was going to jump up and run back to the truck. I stood up to run, and bam! I just felt like I got hit by a truck or something like that, something I didn't see coming. It was a little bit like a physical blow and a little bit like you touched the spark plug wire or something, like an electric shock. And I just blacked out. But in the movie, when that being hit me, they wanted to kind of drag it out and make it longer. And rather than showing how it really was, it was sort of an instantaneous explosion of energy. It was so violent that it threw me through the air, 10 or 20 feet. Steve says 20 feet, but John says my body hit the ground like a sack of meat, like there were no bones in my body. No attempt to protect myself from the fall. It was just so certain in their eyes that it had killed me that they said they started yelling, "It got me, he's dead, let's go, let's go, let's go." So, when I first started talking about this, someone in the audience would very often comment how my coworkers were, being cowardly to take off at that point. And I always want to stress that that would have been very foolish for them to do anything to try to rescue me right then. In their minds, they just saw somebody get killed. Now, why should Mike allow his crew risk their lives to try to save somebody who's already dead? So they did the only sensible thing: get the heck out of there. With the understanding that they had at that point. When they got farther up there, they caught sight of some hunters, they said, and went to try to catch them, thinking, we'll get some people with guns. Because even at that point, they knew they were going to have to see, what was up with me. So when they were unable to catch up with the hunters, they decided they were going to have to come back. Now in the movie, when Mike said, "We got to go," that's really happened, and the rest of the crew said, no, let's not do that, So Mike said, anybody that doesn't want to go back with us can wait here. But in real life, nobody volunteered to stand alone outside the truck in the dark. So in the movie, they wanted, for some reason, Mike to go back by himself. I guess to add to the suspicion that, because the way it was portrayed is that somebody was just telling the story to go on, and they wanted to preserve the possibility in the minds of the viewer that maybe they had murdered me, and this was just a made-up story they were telling. But so they headed back, all of them, and imagine the courage that takes. I mean, they just saw somebody get blasted. They were arguing about whether I was still in one piece when he hit the ground. Kenny said that to him, the scariest thing was not that the craft would still be there or would come back, because they saw it leave as they got closer. But what my body was going to look like when they got there. So it was far more violent than it was portrayed in the movie. And it's surprising that Hollywood decided to do it that way, because you know how they love a light show. They could have made that much more like it really was. Steve said, or John, I think some of them were actually looking in a different direction coincidentally, because they're just frantically looking around like, what's going on here? And they said, when that being hit me, that blast of energy, that it was the brightest thing he'd ever seen in his life. They said that it lit up the woods brighter than daylight as far as they could see. And so they had every reason to think I had been killed. They're coming back. They found where the truck had stopped, because, you know, when Mike took off, he just revved it up and popped the clutch out, and the tires were spinning and couldn't have dug a hole there. And so they said they went and looked and called and stuff. And at one point, Mike, broke down, fell to his knees and started crying. And Kenny helped him up. And, for some reason, Kenny was, keeping it together pretty good. But Mike got his composure back, and on the way back to town, they argued about what to do. And, we got to go get some help. And Alan, he'd always been sort of, in and out of trouble all his life. And he didn't want to go to report it to the police right away. He said, well, let's just go get some friends with guns, and we'll come back. And then if we can't find Travis, then we can report it. But, the others said, look, if Travis is never found, we better just, report this. How's it going to look if we don't report this? That's just the thing to do. So they did. They called the local sheriff deputy, and he came over, Chuck Ellison. He called the sheriff, and he came down with his second in command, the undersheriff, Ken Copeland. And they said that when they got there, that some of the men were still crying. It was, that powerful. When I first published my book about this and mentioned that, the youngest guy in the crew got real mad. He'd come over to my house, and he was saying he wanted to fight. He had to retrieve his sense of masculinity or something. He thought it was such a terrible, shameful revelation that he had been crying. Mike could cry. I'm not ashamed to admit I totally lost control. Throughout this whole thing, I tried to tell Steve, look, the fact that it affected us like that is not a measure of how strong we are as men. It's a measure of how powerful this experience was. But to this day, he's really, got issues with that whole thing. He wanted to go fight Mike, because Mike had verified that he was one of the ones that cried. Mike said, I cried. No, I'm not ashamed of it. So that became a big issue. But the sheriff was also looking to see if they were intoxicated. Now, they could tell something really serious had happened, but the lawmen, unbeknownst to the crew, were suspecting these guys had somehow murdered me, and for some reason were cooperating in some kind of a bizarre cover story. And doesn't that make sense? You kill somebody, and rather than saying, you wandered off, I don't know what happened to me, my wine ate him or something, they say a UFO took him away, But anyway, it just was easier for local people to believe that they had murdered me and made up a crazy story rather than to believe what had really happened. And this is something that kept on. During the following days, they mounted this massive manhunt. Men on horseback, men on four-wheel drive, smaller, all-terrain vehicles, helicopters, airplanes, combing the area and finding no sign. They brought in the tracking dogs from the local prison. The trail went up to the middle of the clearing where I had fallen, and that was the end of the trail. So, the suspicion grew, and whispering spread amongst the searchers, and the men were starting to be accused. John said that when the part of the crew that went out to help with the search, the sheriff made sure that a deputy was with each crewman the whole time. And he said they just continued to say, come on, tell us what really happened. Maybe it wasn't you that killed Travis. But if you help him cover it up, you're going to be in just as much trouble as the guy that did it. So just tell us where he hid the body, and we're going to go home. So the men started getting mad. There was this one violent confrontation. One of the searchers, the Forest Service guy, came up and grabbed Ryan Smith by his shirt and jerked him up and said, come on, where'd you hide the body? And my brother saw it. Hey, knocked that off. He's a very big, imposing sort of guy. He's a professional boxer. So that kind of put the end to that confrontation. But right then they said, look, we're telling the truth. We'll take any kind of test you want. Give us sodium pentothal, give us lie detector test. This really happened, just like he said. Sheriff heard about this. And one thing that happened during the search out there was the crewmen that were there saw this guy with a Geiger counter and went over there and said, hey, what's going on here? What do you find? Nothing. The guy was acting real hostile to him because he thought this was just some crazy story, and you're wasting my time. This was murder, So Mike said, well, why are you testing here? The cracker's over there. You should be measuring it. He says, go ahead, measure us. And he says, well, it's clicking. Doesn't that mean there's radiation? He goes, no, that's just 1.5. That's just background radiation. That's the same everywhere. And he said, see? And he held it up to a radium dial watch on his buddy's wrist there, and it jumped up to 3. And I said, well, we bathed and changed our clothes up, but our hard hats we were wearing, no, they're in the truck. We'll go get them. So we went over there and got the hard hats, and it went up to a reading of 6. Double a radium dial watch. And the guy looks at him like, you kidding me? Walks away. But it was a Forest Service guy that Mike had never seen before. He'd been doing that job for years. And so I'm really wondering if that's who he really was. And I think there was quite a bit of government response to this event right from the get-go. And I'll talk more about that later. But so the sheriff, hearing this talk about polygraphs, he may have planned it on his own anyway. This right here is a picture of the service station where they met with the sheriff. And that's probably important to include that because all kinds of people who wanted to somehow pretend to be knowledgeable about this. This one guy went on the internet and was saying, oh, I know the inside story. Here it was, the crew met with the sheriff at the Red Robin Diner. Well, Red Robin Diner didn't exist for another 20 years. And so then he changed that to the Red Onion now. 20 years later, it was right here. But anyway, he was trying to tell that he was the sheriff's nephew and he had the inside story. He didn't know what he was talking about. So anyway, that was where it was. And the interviews in that film, those little cards on the table there, were done at this service station, which is still there 6 weeks ago. And they just recently bulldozed it. Gone after 40-some years. But there's the sheriff. He passed away in July. And he always did interviews, trying to stick with his skepticism. And it was kind of an image thing. He was an elected official. He didn't want anybody thinking he believed this nonsense. Even though he told the crew that night that he'd seen something himself. And but some of his relatives and friends had sent me emails, which I still have, saying that privately he was much more believing. He was just in a position where he had to do that because he was elected. After this, he was a county supervisor. But he passed away in July. And, I'm interested in kind of pursuing the things that he was talking to people privately. But, you know, they searched helicopters, and there was wild horses out there at the time. It was kind of a thing I used as an example of the kind of impulsiveness that I had back then, that I brought a lasso to work, and I was going to capture one of those. Because, you know, the little horses, they were curious. They'd let me get close enough, and I could roll it and take it home with me. How I was going to get it, then I got a truck. I wouldn't think that far ahead. Those adult horses would have stomped me into the mud if I had succeeded in getting the rope around that. But the wild horses are still there after all this time. It's kind of strange. The stallion will mark the corner of his territory, and that's right at the entrance to where this happened. But the local town, Heber there, their high school mascot is the Mustangs. Anyway, let's advance these a little and get through here. There's Cy Gilson, the polygraph examiner. He came in to test the guys. They're accused of murdering me. And totally expecting to find them, but these guys all flunked. Alan, you know, had been, you know, once a rebel in his life, so he got in a big argument with the examiner. There was actually quite a bit of an argument before that, because the men were real nervous about being framed. You know, they had so much of this pressure about murder that they thought this whole thing was set up to make them look guilty so they could pin it on them. And so, much to this guy's surprise, he found that they were all Alan passing the test. Now, there are people who think that polygraph is not that reliable, you know. It's not 100%, you know, everybody knows that. But it is something that has been researched very thoroughly, you know, with controlled studies and all sorts of things. And you know, properly conducted, they're in the 90th percentile range. And so at the time that 6 of us passed lie detector tests, the president of the American Polygraph Association said that although no one test is 100%, that if you have 6 individuals passing tests on the same issue, the odds are over 1,000,000 to 1 of there being any, you know, possibility of error. Well, the current president of the American Polygraph Association has repeated that, but in light of the fact that now there have been 16 past tests in connection with this case. I passed 5, and from 3 different examiners, all of them with years of law enforcement experience. And not every polygraph examiner has that, but, you know, all people who have been police officers and done work for federal agencies and whatnot. So, you know, the top agencies like FBI, they screen their employees using this. So it is something that the government recognizes as a valuable tool in the right hands. These game show polygraphs are just totally bogus, but when the men passed, that really gave us a big shock to the sheriff. He was expecting a murder. So, what's this? This is my first impression, out of focus. I woke up, I was in a tremendous amount of pain, could not focus my eyes. So I really at first gave up on trying to see, because I was in a great deal of pain. Something was terribly wrong inside. And first I didn't know where I was. Then I remembered approaching the craft, and I thought maybe I'd been hurt somehow. And the crew had taken me to the hospital. And I could feel that they had something laying across my chest, and I could hear the sounds of movement around me. And I'm thinking, you know, I'm in such a serious situation. The fact that I'm laying on a raised surface and so close to the light above me, all gave me the feeling that, you know, I was in a hospital. And then this device across my chest. But when I finally can focus my eyes better, I see this light above me, and then I look, and there's the face of this creature right there, so close to me. It was such a shock to realize this was not a hospital. I was in a bad situation. And so this feeling of being mortally wounded, and the shock of seeing this face so close to me. And then when I try to move, find out I'm too weak, I can hardly move, and that adds to the fear. So I tried to hit it away from me, and it was more like just barely being able to move my arm. But it was softer and lighter than I expected. And it fell back into the other one, and almost simultaneously I rolled away from it, and this device on my chest fell off, and there was some kind of light coming out from under it. But I was mainly just focused on them, and I was backing away and screaming at them, and they were coming around the table towards me, and when I bumped up against this shelf behind me, there was some instruments lying out there, and I just glanced quickly to just see what it was, and grabbed the biggest thing there, and just started swinging through the air and screaming, don't come any closer. And they stopped out of range. And at that moment where they were just standing there staring, it was so excruciating, them looking at me. And for a long time I thought it was just the fear of that penetrating stare that seemed emotionless. And humans always interpret, even amongst ourselves, if you sense that the person that's looking at you doesn't care one way or the other, we tend to interpret that as hostile. Maybe it's not necessarily so. So that just, here I'm screaming in total panic, and I'm not seeing reaction. So that added to the fear. But above all was this feeling of suffocation. I couldn't feel like I could catch my breath. It felt like I needed more air. I don't know whether this was a side effect of that energy that hit me, or that maybe they had an atmosphere in there that just wasn't correct for humans. But that stare was so, it gave me this sort of a squirmy feeling in my head, and I've had a lot of time to think about it because, that was just the focus of my nightmares for so long, and it didn't make sense that stare was that, would have that much of an effect on me. And so I was wondering about that. And I had a medical doctor come up to me in one of my recent talks like this, and he was saying, well, the skull, some of the largest openings in the skull are, where the eyes are. And if they're projecting some kind of energy at you, they would use the stare just to focus the energy. And perhaps being strength. So the three of them together were trying to control me, and it was just hurting. And after I was returned, I did an EEG. I was part of a bunch of medical tests that I underwent. And the technician was not told who I was. So all he knew was that this is Barrow's Neurological Institute, a world-famous brain trauma center, and the technician isn't told who I was or what had happened just to look for signs of injury. And he found an anomalous brainwave pattern that was mentioned in the report. So in the follow-up research, what I'm looking for is, A, is that pattern still there? And B, is these original charts still, is it something like you would see in a person that's been electrocuted or hit by lightning? And I'm thinking that what happened there, that if they have the powers of, psychic control of people, you hear these reports all the time, that it wasn't working on me because of this energy that hit me. And it just sort of scrambled the neural circuits. Well, for whatever reason, rather than continuing to try to subdue me, they just turned and left. So I went looking. Got to find a way out of here. I'm going to comment on eyes a little bit more. A lot of people who have encountered these types of beings report the eye as having a shiny black surface with no eyelid or eyelashes or blinking of any kind. But I saw them blink and I saw a pupil. And so, unless this is a variety that just happens to be similar to these beings that they now call grays, they didn't have the terminology in 1975, but it might be that they actually wear some sort of a black covering over their eye in order to protect them from levels of light that we would consider dim. Just about every creature that has a huge oversized eye that lives on the earth is something that's either nocturnal or lives under the sea or in a cave, something that where they're normally exposed to very low levels of light. So that's just my speculation. I think a lot of what's called grays, maybe a number of species that just happen to be similar. I left the room. They went out the door and went to the right. I pieced this together later, but at the time I had no idea where it was. To me, I was just blindly trying to find my way out of there, and traveling down this curved pathway. There was a passageway, but it curved so tightly, so dimly lit, I couldn't see if they were chasing me, because they would have been around the corner, and I couldn't see if I was running into something worse. So I was really torn about what I was doing, but at the same time, just blind panic. So I came to this room and I looked into it, and it was kind of like what you saw, these lights that are on the wall here. It was a planetarium-like surface that only became evident. It was visible mostly the closer you got to the chair. And the chair was in the middle of the room. The main reason I entered is because I could see rectangles on the wall that might have been doorways. And all I was thinking was open a door and escape. Now, from that diagram, you can see that none of those doors could have possibly opened to the outside. But in my, hysteria, I was not thinking clearly, and I was thinking, open the door about 15 feet to the ground and be back in the woods. Good thing I didn't open the door, because it could have been in a very bad place. But there was a chair there, and I was afraid somebody might be sitting there, so I moved to, see from the side first. But I started actually trying to push buttons and see if I could open the door. The doors themselves you could see the outline, but there was no doorknob, no button, nothing that I could see that would open it. So I was thinking the controls on that chair might open it. And most of those controls didn't seem to operate anything, least of all the doors. So I was thinking of pushing another button. This planetarium effect, I don't know whether it was actually a view of where it was, or if it was some kind of a simulation of what it was. In other words, are we seeing directly through the craft, or are they somehow projecting something to represent how it is? And I doubt that it would be something they would navigate by, but it would probably more likely be something that if they were trying to move it into a hangar or into another ship or something, that they might need to see around to make sure they're clear. I don't know, you might think something you could never guess, that should all be automatic, you think, but the star pattern also moved in response to the control on the chair, which was very disorienting, because if you were standing in a room where the only visible light was 8 points and they suddenly all moved in unison, you had the initial impulse to think you were losing your balance. And because I was in such a weakened condition, I was already kind of unsteady on my feet. But I was thinking of messing with more of those buttons to see if I could get a door open, when the door that I came through, something drew my attention, whether a change in the light or just caught it out of the corner of my eye. I saw this guy there, And I just thought, this was somebody from the Air Force. This was somebody to rescue me from these horrible monsters that had me. And so I was just filled with relief that he was there, assuming that this was a rescue. He wanted me to go with him. I went. I took him to be a human being, maybe some Earth-based agency, Air Force, I don't know. He took me out of the craft, and we could go back to that diagram and show how it, at this point, was inside of this huge enclosure. And I call it an enclosure because I couldn't tell whether it was a building like an airplane hangar or part of a larger craft. The light seemed to be kind of like natural light, just like sunlight would be in color. But I tried to look around. There were other crafts that were in there, a more rounded form. But he seemed to be in a hurry. He was hurrying me along. And I had to really watch to keep from stumbling. I was in a very weakened condition. And the air was easier to breathe out there, but I was still felt very wounded, very something wrong inside. And I wanted to explain how that feeling of suffocation added to the feeling of panic. I was comparing it to waterboarding and how even though the people who experience waterboarding know that it never kills anybody, they've heard about it, they know about it, but it is so frightening it works anyway. I mean, they even train for it. They actually do it to their people before, there are people trained, but it still works because the feeling of suffocation generates a panic that you just can't, reason away. So in the movie, the actor is held down on the table. He's got a membrane over his face, and he's trying to yell through it, trying to breathe through it. And that didn't really happen, but I think if you just showed him standing there breathing hard and looking panicked, you would not understand the way you do if you see that membrane, that feeling of suffocation. So there's certain fictionalizations that happened in the movie that just, were pointless in my view, but that was one that I thought helped communicate to the audience. Anyway, he took me out of this craft, across this large open area, and down a hallway into a room with some other people. Now, he had this helmet on his head, and when he would answer me, wouldn't respond to my questions, I thought it was because maybe he couldn't hear or couldn't speak with that on. Well, when he got me in there in this room, there was some other people dressed like him except for the helmet. And I thought, they can hear me. I'm going to ask them, where am I? What's going on here? I was out of my mind, And they didn't answer. They tried to lead me over to this table and get me laid down. And I started to resist. I was in a very weakened condition, but they seemed very strong and were able to get me down on the table there. And one of them put this mask over my face that apparently had some sort of gas because I lost consciousness real quickly. It wasn't painful. I tried to pull it away, but it was too late. So I didn't remember anything more until I woke up on the highway outside of Eber. Now, where in the 5 days this conscious period was, I don't know. Could have been near the beginning, near the end, or somewhere. Probably somewhere more in the middle, because let me tell you what I've come to conclude, after years of thinking about it. Rather than it being some kind of senselessly cruel experiment where they just taken me on board to poke me and see what is going on, that being wasn't a weapon being fired at me, that it was some kind of an accidental discharge, that when I stood up, at that point, I closed the distance between me and the surface of that craft, and this energy just jumped to ground through me. So, kind of like, in the winter, you got a lot of static and you get your finger closer and closer to something, and when it's close enough, a spark jumps. Only on a grand scale. There's the UFO skeptics who try to say that pilots, whenever they see the UFOs, it's really due to this incredible energy that builds up in the surface of airplanes. Just from traveling through the air at high speed, it builds up static charges that are actually measured in millions of volts. Now, as a student pilot, we would always take this wire from the fuel truck, clip it onto the airplane before you brought the fuel nozzle over there, so that any energy that was stored in the airplane would be grounded and not ignite a fire. So it's true that there's millions of volts, but that does not account for what pilots see. So this would have been a similar charge on a very grand scale that injured me. Maybe a side effect of the propulsion system, who knows. Maybe it had something to do with what those beams were doing in that clearing. That they were perhaps doing something, some sort of an agricultural experiment involving trees. But this unusual pattern in the brainwave thing kind of supports the idea that is what was going on there. And I had the opportunity to talk to some people, some of the school children who were involved in that incident in Zimbabwe, where there were 60 kids at recess, and this craft came down, these beams came out, and actually communicated to them through this stair. And I asked these people what that felt like. Did it feel the way it felt when they were doing that with me? And they said, no, it was pleasant. And the message was, I'm not frightening. And so that's what leads me to think now that it had something to do with that injury that happened because of this blast of energy hitting me. At that point, they thought I was dead. I probably was. The crew did not know CPR. The nearest hospital over an hour away. It's possible that these beings took me aboard, not to quote abduct me, but to resuscitate me, to revive me. And that's why I was kept so long, 5 days. Healing is not an instantaneous process, but certainly, if they were able to correct the damage that came from that blast, that it was close to miraculous in terms of our science. And a whole battery of medical tests that I underwent kind of supports all that. So this is ongoing research. Let's move on up here. These are the phone booths that I went to that night. I was let off on the highway. I recognized the lights of Heber down below, and I ran down there, tried to get some people to come to the door, pounding on the door, screaming like a maniac. And they didn't come, so they either didn't hear me or thought I was too dangerous. And so I ran on down and I found these phone booths. I went into the one on the far right there, and it was out of order. And I was at the end of my rope. I used up the last of my strength to get there. But I went into the middle one, and it worked. And this is how these phone booths look to this day. There are no more phone booths anywhere there on the mountain. And these haven't been functioning for years, but they are kind of a local landmark on kind of what happened. And when I called my family to get help, people say, well, how could you do that? In that part of the country at the time, I didn't even have to have a quarter to talk to the operator. Just, die low and make a collect call. I'm screaming like crazy. Operator thought something's up here. She listened in on the call. Totally illegal, but she called the sheriff. And I'm glad she did. Broken the law, but these skeptics were trying to claim that I was someplace else entirely. And so that proved that I was there. The sheriff said a man out there said fingerprint the phone booth that night. But they got there later than my family. They came and got me. And I was in pretty bad shape. I just collapsed after I finished the call. My brother here said something about how worried our mother, and I didn't understand. And he picked up on that I thought this was still the same night that the incident happened, rather than 5 days later. And he said, "Travis, feel your face." I reached up and I felt a 5-day growth of beard. And I was already I was trying to talk to him, and it was all just totally broken up. I was just basically hacking out sobs. I was trying to tell him what I'd been through. And it was, basically, I just went catatonic at that point. I could hardly function. And my brother, who passed away here a while back now, basically saved my life, because I was in such a fragile condition. Sheriff didn't care. They wanted their research. The news media didn't care. And he protected me at great personal risk and sacrifice in his own career. He was a horseshoer and works with a whole lot of people who think kindly on stories of this kind. And he lost a lot of customers over it, but he protected me. It was really, really hard going for a long time. The news media, there was just a frenzy of all kinds of things being said. Once they had to give up that I had been murdered, it was a whole lot of other stuff. They tried to say that I had a transitory psychosis, that it temporarily become insane, believed this happened to me, and then took a lie detector test, and so I think it happened, but I was really crazy. So I did a whole battery of tests with, sponsored by this organization, the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, and the psychiatric testing was a totally normal pattern of scores. And then another theory was that it was a drug hallucination. The doctor noted a wound on my arm, which he specifically said was not over any major blood vessel, but this became a drug injection. And somehow these were hallucinogens that would be injected. That is not the way that's done, in my understanding. But I had medical tests, blood and urine samples put through the Maricopa County Medical Examiner's drug screen, which proved there was no drug of any kind in my body. But all these little explanations that came along. It was a story made up to get Mike out of his logging contract. Well, because of the incident, the contract was given to another crew, but it had nothing to do. The incident wasn't even mentioned at the meeting. The contract was defaulted. It had no effect on 10% retention or payments or anything. So, and the contracting officers actually signed an affidavit saying there is no way such a story could have benefited Mike in terms of his logging contract. Let's see, this was, to refute these theories that the skeptics were putting out, one after another. There was a theory that the hypnotist, Dr. James Harder, had planted these ideas in my head. But, the hypnosis was observed by a whole bunch of reporters, including my brother, and there were no leading questions. Everything was just, you tell me, I'm telling you what happened. So I made the observation that, from the beginning, explain it away, including murder, were people grasping at straws, looking for some way that they could justify not believing something they don't want to believe. And it doesn't have to be a very good argument for them to say, oh yeah, that must be it, you know. Oh, Travis is just looking for attention. I was hiding from the media for weeks, you know, and they were saying that I must be looking for something because I don't want to talk to them. So, you know, you can't win. You know, damned if you do, and damned if you don't. And so, after a while, I realized that if I refused to do the interview, it didn't kill the story, it just made it more negative. Because all they had to talk to was people who were throwing out stuff like drug hallucination when the evidence was there that proved that couldn't possibly be true. So I was dragged into it. People, you know, compliment me. They said, well, great that you were brave enough to come forward and tell your story. Well, I was dragged into it, you know, and it's, you know, something I've been faced with, I've had to deal with, and a lot of research went on. That's on the far right there is Dr. J. Allen Hynek, astronomer at Northwestern University. He was worked for the Air Force on Project Blue Book, investigating UFOs. And that's another thing that the UFO skeptics are fond of saying, there is no evidence. There's been studies, lots of studies. And, you know, Stanton Friedman is a UFO researcher, and he's always debating these skeptics, and they're always saying stuff like, they're, you know, trying to say the evidence isn't there, and he's showing them right where the evidence is, you know. So, we're going to get to the end here. This skeptic that was attacking me and launching all these attacks, after he passed away, it was okay to get his FBI file through the Freedom of Information Act. And this right here is a memo written by the director, J. Edgar Hoover, director of the FBI, to the director of the Central Intelligence Agency, who is not named. That's so secret back in those days. But it does say director of CIA. And prior to 9/11, these two agencies were criticized for not communicating, not working together. But here they are. The FBI had been investigating this UFO skeptic, and they're turning the whole matter over to the CIA. And my contention is that this is typical CIA recruiting tactic. Get some offense that you can hold over somebody's head and then get the cooperation. And it's not just cooperation. I don't think they turned this guy into a UFO skeptic. He was already a UFO skeptic, but I think what they did was, you know, get control of him. Anyway, he came to Steve Pierce, the youngest guy on the crew, sent the message through the local law enforcement people, so that's, you can't deny that this happened. Deputy Click carried the message to Steve that this guy was offering $10,000 to him if he would discredit the case. And this is a bribe. Where was he getting the money? Not from his job at Aviation Leasing and Space Technology. This is quotations from the FBI file. Class is well known to us, deficient on all points of his argument. It's the FBI talking. Newark is in possession of class mail to Bell Laboratories. But reading the letter indicates Ryan is most likely not in full possession of his faculties. BUFILE, which is an abbreviation for states in view of class's intemperate criticisms and often irrational statements made to support them, it was recommended that the Bureau be most circumspect in any future contacts with him. But it's what these agencies call useful idiots, you know. He has a proclivity so they can use him as a disinformation specialist. Mike Rogers, the crew boss, and I were interviewed on Larry King, and Mike just flat said, you know, that's what he is. He's a disinformation specialist in Washington, D.C. And these documents, these memos, this FBI file, proves that. And so here I was blasted by this guy. He wrote parts of several books and dozens of white papers, sending them out to the media, telling him what a horrible person I was, digging up every piece of dirt he could ever get. You know, go to your 5th grade teacher, what did he do wrong, you know? And I had plenty of evidence of instances where he would go to people to try to get a bad story, and he heard got a good story, you'd never hear it in the stuff he wrote. He was only looking for bad. And he went to the extreme where he would actually alter a quotation. You know, he would reverse the meaning of what was said. On the subject of the bribe, he never actually denied the bribe. What he said was that Mike said that if you take it, he'll be bruised. See, Mike was threatening Steve to keep him from recanting. The full quotation said, if you take the money, even though you know what really happened and would do it just for the money, then you'll be bruised. And he went to the trouble to take all that middle part out and just put 3 little dots in there and try to make it look like Mike was just threatening Steve to keep him recanting when he was actually talking specifically, you know, to the contrary. So there was a lot of very deceitful tactics in the campaign waged against us. And he was constantly sending this stuff out to the media, and it was about, you know, for years. But we did an interview with the hard copy or Inside Edition, one of those shows, during the run-up to the release of Fire in the Sky, the movie. And Mike noticed that the trees in the clearing, we found it hard to find, and I thought it was because there was so much snow out there. Paramount rented these giant snow cats from the ski run, and they got these big, wide, you know, 5-foot wide metal tracks that can just drive right over the top of snowdrifts. So we got out there because they just had to have an interview on the site. So that's what we did. We went out there, and I found out later that Mike recognized that part of why it was hard to find was because the trees were bigger than they should have been. And he went back the following spring and said nothing to me. Next slide. And took this sample. And he found a tree nearest where the craft had come down had been 85 years old at the time of the incident. And in the next 15 years, doubled in diameter. And because this is the outside of a circle, you do the math. And it turns out that these trees were suddenly producing wood fiber at 36 times the rate they had before. And this is some of the calculations. It's not really a cylinder. The geometry is based on a cone, and it's pretty complicated, you know, because it's the outside of the circle rather than the inside of the circle. So, you know, the tree was now 100 years old, but in 15 years it doubled in size and doubled in diameter. And Mike was trying not to kill the trees. You know, he was just trying to take a sample, and then he cut a piece of wood perfectly to fit that hole and put it in there with this 100-year caulking compound that you put on your windows and stuff to seal it up. And he put that in. That stuff is still there. It held up all this time. But the core sample was from just one side of the tree. Now, Ben came out, we did a research expedition to the site, and he was supervising. We did a whole lot of stuff, you know, and he'll probably be the one to describe that to you, but we discovered something else. You want to talk about that now?
We'll do a Q&A.
Okay, we'll do a Q&A. But basically, what he was there when we discovered that this rapid growth was on the side of the tree towards where the craft had been, whether north, south, east, or west. It was directional. Which we'll get into more later. It was quite remarkable, and this just gets into some interesting little things. There was a area map of Arizona, and I found the area where it happened, and coincidentally, they had named it Area 51. And this, you know, my son on the right there came with me to talk. He said, "Oh, you brought BBC with you." So my daughter's a photographer. She posted this picture, and you can see the similarity was incredible. Now, before you think my wife met B.B. Sweeney, he would have been 8 years old when my son was born. But, it was quite a coincidence, the similarity. Although B.B. Sweeney is being chosen to play me in the movie, I didn't think he looked anything like me, but he sure